Covert Action in Chile, 1963 to 1973. Chapter 4. Chile. Authorization, Assessment, and Oversight. A. 40 Committee Authorization and Control. Chile, 1969 to 1973. First, 40 Committee Functions and Procedures. Throughout its history, the 40 Committee and its direct predecessors, the 303 Committee and the Special Group, have had one overriding purpose: to exercise political control over covert operations abroad. The 40 Committee is charged with considering the objectives of any proposed activity, whether or not it would accomplish these aims, and in general, whether or not it would be proper and in the American interest. Minutes and summaries of 40 Committee meetings on Chile indicate that, by and large, these considerations were discussed and occasionally debated by 40 Committee members. In addition to exercising political control, the 40 Committee has been responsible for framing covert operations in such a way that they could later be disavowed or plausibly denied by the United States government, or at least by the President. In the case of Chile, of course, this proved to be an impossible task. Not only was CIA involvement in Chile blown, but in September 1974, President Ford publicly acknowledged at a press conference U.S. covert involvement in Chile. Before covert action proposals are presented to the Director for submission to the 40 Committee, an internal CIA instruction states that they should be coordinated with the Department of State and that, ordinarily, concurrence by the ambassador to the country concerned is required. Should and ordinary were underscored for an important reason. Major covert action proposals are not always coordinated among the various agencies, nor, for that matter, are they always discussed and/or approved by the 40 Committee. The Chile case demonstrates that in at least one instance, the so-called Track 2 activity, the President instructed the CIA not to inform or coordinate this activity with the Departments of State or Defense or the ambassador in the field, nor was the 40 Committee ever informed. Not all covert activities are approved by the 40 Committee. Projects not deemed politically risky or involving large sums of money can be approved within the CIA. By CIA statistics, only about 1/4 of all covert operation projects are considered by the 40 Committee. The committee has not been able to determine what percentage of covert action projects conducted by the CIA in Chile were approved within the CIA or required 40 Committee authorization. Despite this fact, the committee has found evidence of projects not considered by the 40 Committee, thus conforming to its general authorization rule. This is not to imply that the CIA undertook activities in Chile behind the back of the 40 Committee or without its approval. The agency was simply following the authorization procedures for covert projects that then existed. These same procedures exist today. There have been numerous criticisms of 40 Committee procedures, some of which follow. The criteria by which covert operations are brought before the 40 Committee appears to be fuzzy. The real degree of accountability for covert actions remains to be determined. There is a basic conflict between sufficient consultation to ensure accountability and sound decisions on the one hand, and secure operations on the other. The risk of inadequate consultation may be aggravated by the more informal procedure of telephone clearances, which has been used by the 40 Committee for the last few years. The review of covert actions by the 40 Committee does not appear to be searching or thorough. There still appears to be a serious risk that operations will end only when they come to grief. Second, 40 Committee approvals. According to a chronology of 40 Committee meetings, the committee met on 23 separate occasions between March 1970 and October 1973 to authorize funds for covert activities in Chile. Footnote number 1. The use of the term 40 Committee meetings must not be taken in a literal sense. At the outset of the Nixon administration, the 40 Committee did meet frequently to discuss and approve, as well as review, U.S. covert activities. However, within a relatively short period of time, these formal meetings of the 40 Committee were replaced by less frequent meetings and a system of telephone clearances. Today, the 40 Committee rarely meets. Covert action proposals prepared by the DCI are distributed to the various 40 Committee principals, and approvals or disapprovals are obtained over the phone by the 40 Committee Special Group Officer, a CIA officer on loan to the NSC staff. End footnote. During this period, the committee authorized a total of $8.8 million for CIA cover activities in Chile. Of this amount, $6.5 million was spent. The range of CIA activities in Chile approved by the 40 Committee included spoiling operations against Allende prior to the September 4th election, assistance to Chilean political parties, a contingency fund for Ambassador Corey's use to influence the October 24 congressional vote, purchase of a Chilean radio to be used as a political opposition instrument against Allende, assistance to specific political candidates, emergency aid to keep the Santiago paper, El Mercurio, afloat, and support for Anti-Allende Businessmen Association. Third, policy splits within the 40 Committee. Unanimity was not a hallmark of the 40 Committee meetings on Chile, at least during the period April 1969 to October 1970. Stated simply, the State Department was generally skeptical about intervening in the Chilean electoral process, whereas the CIA, the U.S. Ambassador to Chile, the Defense Department, and the White House favored intervention. The question of whether anything should be done with regard to the September 1970 presidential election in Chile was first raised at a meeting of the 303 Committee on April 15, 1969. It was not until December 1969, however, that a joint embassy-CIA proposal for a campaign directed against Allende was submitted to the committee. At this December meeting, two State Department officials questioned the need for U.S. involvement in the election. One state official commented that an Allende victory would not be the same as a communist victory. The U.S. ambassador to Chile, Edward Corey, who had been recalled for consultation, disagreed. He stated that operationally, one must treat an Allende victory as the same thing as a communist victory. Corey went on to state that, in his view, an Allende government would be worse than a Castro government. On March 25, 1970, the 40 Committee approved a spoiling operation against Allende and approved $125,000 for this purpose. Again, however, the State Department, represented by Under-Secretary of State U. Alexis Johnson, indicated that the department remained lukewarm to any involvement in the election and informed the 40 Committee that the department would be quite cool to a more positive approach. One further example of policy disagreement within the 40 Committee was evidenced in a summary of a September 29, 1970 40 Committee meeting. This meeting occurred a little more than 3 weeks after Allende had won his plurality victory on September 4th. The question of applying economic pressure to Chile was raised, with the hope that this pressure would create the conditions which would lead to a military coup. After a run-through of possible economic pressures that could be brought to bear on Chile, provided by the CIA's Deputy Director for Plans, Thomas Carmesines, Under-Secretary of State Johnson noted that to swear from 40 Committee-type action to economic warfare was tantamount to a change in foreign policy. Despite this concern, the 40 Committee did decide to increase economic pressures in Chile. The State Department was not happy with this turn of events. Assistant Secretary of State Charles Mayer remarked that should Allende be confirmed, the U.S. could place the burden on Allende for all that he did, and, after all, he will not be around forever. This view was not accepted by the CIA. Director Helms remarked at the meeting that Allende's Marxist pronouncements would be taken at face value, while Carmesines added that a hands-off policy in Chile at this time would be read as the U.S. throwing in the sponge. As evidenced by later 40 Committee authorizations, the sponge was not thrown in. B. Intelligence estimates and covert action. The intelligence community produces several kinds of assessments for policymakers. Of these, the most important are National Intelligence Estimates, NIEs, Joint, agreed assessment of foreign politics and capabilities produced by the U.S. intelligence community. This section, based on a review of NIEs and other intelligence memoranda. Footnote number 2. These include intelligence memoranda produced by the CIA's Office of Current Intelligence, OCI, and intelligence notes produced by the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR. And footnote. Regarding Chile, written during 1969 to 1973, will trace the intelligence community's best estimates of what an agenda government signified for U.S. interest. NIEs are approved by the United States Intelligence Board, USIB. Dissenting agencies can register footnotes. Prior to 1973, a formal board of national estimates supervised the production of drafts by a special office of national estimates. In 1973, that structure was replaced by a system of national intelligence officers, NIOs, senior analysis drawn from the CIA and other intelligence agencies. There have been persistent criticisms of NIEs, and many of these remain with the new structure. The documents are least common denominator compromises, and, thus, are of little value to policymakers. They are oriented toward short-range predictions rather than long-run assessments. Another criticism deals not with the NIEs themselves, but with their use or abuse. It is charged that policymakers ignore NIEs or consult them only when estimates confirm their pre-existing policy preferences. First, the Chile estimates. Between 1969 and 1973, 5 Chile NIEs were produced, one in each year. In addition, several intelligence memoranda and intelligence notes relating to Chile were prepared by CIA and state. The likely policies and goals of an Allende's administration, as predicted by the intelligence community, follow. A. Chile under Allende. A July 1970 Chile NIE, prepared a little over a month before the September election, raised the question of what an Allende victory would mean to Chile and the United States. The NIE occasioned considerable disagreement within the Washington community. The disagreement reflected a division between the Department of State on one side and the U.S. ambassador and the CIA station on the other. The latter position was that an Allende victory would mean the gradual imposition of a classic Marxist-Leninist regime in Chile. This position was reflected, with some qualifying remarks, in the NIE. The 1917 NIE stated, in strong terms, that an Allende administration would proceed as rapidly as possible toward the establishment of Marxist socialist state. It would be a Chilean version of a Soviet-style East European communist state. The intelligence community predicted that although democracy was likely to survive in Chile over the next 2 or 3 years, Allende could take Chile a long way down the Marxist socialist road during the 6 years of his administration. To do this, however, he would have to surmount some very important obstacles, such as Chile's security forces, the Christian Democratic Party, some elements of organized labor, the Congress, and the Catholic Church. The NIE noted that Allende undoubtedly expected progress on basic bread and butter issues, which would afford him an opportunity to secure control of the Congress in the 1973 election, and thereby enable him to impose a socialist state of the Marxist variety by the Via Pacifica, peaceful road. The next NIE issued on Chile in August 1971 was less shrill on the threat which Allende represented to Chilean democracy. He had been in office 9 months. The NIE stated that the consolidation of Marxist political leadership in Chile was not inevitable, and that Allende had a long, hard way to go to achieve this. The NIE warned, however, that Allende would almost certainly prefer to adhere to constitutional means. He was likely to be impelled to use political techniques of increasingly dubious legality to perpetuate his coalition and power. Up to that point, the NIE observed Allende had taken great care to observe constitutional forms and was enjoying considerable popularity in Chile. The next NIE came out in June 1972. The prospects for the continuation of democracy in Chile appeared to be better than any time since Allende's inauguration. The NIE stated that the traditional political system in Chile continued to demonstrate remarkable resiliency. Legislative, student, and trade union elections continued to take place in normal fashion, with pro-government forces accepting the results while they were adverse. The NIE noted that the Christian Democratic Party and the National Party had used their combined control of both houses of Congress to stall government initiatives and to pass legislation designed to curtail Allende's powers. In addition, the opposition news media had been able to resist government intimidation and persisted in denouncing the government. The NIE concluded that the most likely course of events in Chile for the next year or so would be the moves by Allende towards slowing the pace of his revolution in order to accommodate the opposition and to preserve the gains he had already made. One final NIE on Chile was issued prior to Allende's overthrow in September 1973. That NIE focused on the prospects for the consolidation of power by Allende's regime. It concluded that at the juncture of political standoff seemed to be the most likely course of events in Chile. The NIE stated that Allende had not consolidated the power of his Marxist regime. The bulk of low-income Chileans believed that he had improved their condition and represented their interest, and the growth in support for his coalition reflected his political ability as well as the popularity of his measures. The NIE did warn, however, that the growing polarization of Chilean society was wearing away the Chilean predilection for political compromise. Nevertheless, the analysts predicted that there was only an outside chance that the military would move to force Allende from office. B. U.S.-Chilean relations. Almost 2 years before Allende was elected, the intelligence community predicted that future U.S.-Chilean relations would be under repeated strains, regardless of which party won the 1970 presidential election. A 1969 NIE stated that whoever succeeded Frey in the presidency was likely to continue to stress Chilean independence, to be less cooperative with the U.S. than Frey had been, and to explore somewhat broader relations with communist countries. This NIE noted that were Allende to win, his administration would almost certainly take steps aimed at moving Chile away from the U.S. The NIE also observed that steps toward either government participation in or outright nationalization of U.S. copper holdings in Chile were inevitable. A 1970 NIE, issued 1 month before Allende's September victory, was quite pessimistic about the future U.S.-Chilean relations. It stated that if Allende were to win the election, he would almost certainly take harsh measures against U.S. business interests in Chile and challenge U.S. policies in the hemisphere. The NIE cited several foreign policy problems on Allende regime would pose for the U.S., including recognition of Cuba, possible withdrawal from the OAS, the deterioration of relations with Argentina, and anti-U.S. votes in the United Nations. The NIE predicted, however, that Allende would probably not seek a break with the United States over the next 2 years. A 1971 NIE, issued 10 months into Allende's term in office, stated that U.S.-Chilean relations were dominated by the problems of nationalization, although Allende himself seemed to wish to avoid a confrontation. A 1972 Chile NIE noted that Allende, to date, had sought to avoid irreparable damage to his relations with Washington. Although the major problem concerning U.S.-Chilean relations continued to be that of compensation for the nationalization of U.S. companies. The 1972 NIE stated that Allende had taken pains to publicly stress his desire for amicable relations. A 1973 NIE concluded that Allende had kept lines open to Washington on possible Chilean compensation for expropriated U.S. copper companies. C. Allende's relation with socialist countries. The 1969 Chile NIE predicted that any new administration would explore somewhat broader relations with communist and socialist countries. The NIE noted that Allende, in particular, would take such steps, but that he would be deterred from moving too far in this direction due to a Chilean nationalism, which would as strongly oppose subordinating Chile to the tutelage of Moscow or Havana as to Washington. Allende did, over the years, expand Chile's relations with socialist and communist countries. However, Allende was, as a 1971 NIE stated, careful not to subordinate Chilean interest to any communist or socialist power, or to break existing ties with non-communist nations on whom he continued to rely for aid. Chile NIEs in 1971 and 1972 emphasized that Allende was charting an independent, nationalistic course both within the hemisphere and internationally. Allende was, in short, committed to a policy of non-alignment. D. Allende's ties with Cuba. The 1970 NIE on Chile predicted that Allende would recognize Cuba. He did so, shortly after he was inaugurated. However, the pattern of Chilean-Cuban relations was described in a 1971 NIE as one of ideological distance and closer economic ties. The NIE stated that despite Allende's long-standing personal relationship with Castro, he had refrained from excessive overtures to him. A 1972 NIE noted that Havana had been circumspect about trying to use Chile as a base for prompting revolution throughout Latin America. E. Soviet influence in Chile. Concern about the expansion of Soviet influence in Chile under Allende was the possible establishment of major Soviet military presence was expressed in 1970. A 1971 NIE predicted that although the Soviet Union would continue to cultivate channels of influence into Allende's government throughout the Chilean Communist Party, it would probably be unsure of its ability to make a decisive impact on key issues given Allende's desire for an independent posture. The same NIE noted that neither Allende nor the Chilean military establishment would probably tolerate a permanent Soviet military presence in Chile. A 1972 Chile NIE focused on the Soviet attitude to the Allende regime and noted that Soviet overtures to Allende had thus far been characterized by caution and restraint. This was, in part, due to Soviet reluctance to antagonize the U.S. and, more importantly, a Soviet desire to avoid with Allende the type of open-ended commitment for aid that they had entered into with Castro. A 1972 intelligence note prepared by the State Department stated that a Soviet-Chilean communique issued following Allende's December visit to the USSR reflected Moscow's decision to continue a cautious policy towards Chile and to avoid a major open-ended commitment of aid to Allende. According to the intelligence note, the Soviets apparently advised Allende to negotiate his difference with the U.S. F. Chile as a bait for Latin America subversion. Prior to Allende's election, concern was expressed about Chilean subversion in other countries. An intelligence memorandum prepared by the CIA and issued shortly after Allende's September 4 plurality victory stated that Chile had long been a relatively open country for extreme leftists and would become even more so under Allende. The memorandum noted, however, that Allende would be cautious in providing assistance to extremists for fear of provoking a military reaction in his own country. The memorandum went on to observe that the degree to which revolutionary groups would be allowed to use Chile as a base of operations would be limited to some extent by the Orthodox Communist Party in Chile, which opposed violence-prone groups. A State Department intelligence note prepared in June 1971 stated that, contrary to some earlier indications that Allende might provide clandestine assistance to neighboring insurgency movements, evidence to date suggested that he had been sensitive to the concerns of neighboring governments and had sought to avoid action which would strain bilateral relations. The intelligence note stated that Chile had warned Argentine and Mexican expatriates that they would reside in Chile only if they did not engage in political activities, and that some of the more politically active Brazilian exiles had been encouraged to depart Chile. The note concluded by predicting that it was unlikely that Allende would provide financial support or training to facilitate the export of insurgency. A 1972 NIE stated that Allende had gone to great lengths to convince his Latin American neighbors that he did not share Castro's revolutionary goals, although some revolutionaries in Chile had received arms and funds from extremists in Allende's political coalition. This had probably not occurred at his behest. G. Threat Assessment. The most direct statement concerning the threat an Allende regime would pose to the United States was contained in a CIA intelligence memorandum issued shortly after Allende's September 4th election victory. The memorandum summarized the views of the Interdepartmental Group for Inter-American Affairs, which prepared the response to National Security Study Memorandum 97. The group, made up of officials representing CIA, State, Defense, and the White House, concluded that the United States had no vital interest within Chile. The world military balance of power will not be significantly altered by an Allende regime, and an Allende victory in Chile would not pose any likely threat to the peace of the region. The group noted, however, that an Allende victory would threaten hemispheric cohesion and would represent a psychological setback to the U.S., as well as a definite advance for the Marxist idea. Second, estimates and covert action. As a result of this look at the Chile estimates, a number of comments can be made concerning them and their relation to decisions about covert action. A. Despite the view expressed by the Interdepartmental Group and reported in a CIA intelligence memorandum that the U.S. had no vital national interest in Chile, the decision was made by the executive branch to intervene in that nation's internal political and economic affairs before the election, between it and the congressional vote, and during Allende's tenure in office. It appears that the Chile NIEs were either, at best, selectively used or, at worst, disregarded by policymakers when the time came to make decisions regarding U.S. covert involvement in Chile. 40 committee decisions regarding Chile reflected greater concern about the internal and international consequences of an Allende's government that was reflected in the intelligence estimate. At the same time as the Chile NIEs were becoming less shrill, the 40 committee authorized greater amount of money for covert operations in Chile. The amount authorized by the 40 committee rose from $1.5 million in 1970 to $3.6 million in 1971, $2.5 million in 1972, and, during the first 8 months of 1973, $1.2 million. Covert action decisions were not, in short, entirely consistent with intelligence estimates. B. As noted, NIEs are designed to provide economic and political assessment and an analysis of trends. As such, they are vulnerable to being interpreted by policymakers to support whatever conclusion the policymakers wish to draw from them. The estimates do, however, serve to narrow the range of uncertainty about future events in Chile, and thus narrow the range of justifiable U.S. policies, but a range remained. For example, a 1971 estimate stated that, on the one hand, Allende was moving skillfully and confidently toward his declared goal of building a revolutionary nationalistic socialist society on Marxist principles, but, on the other hand, the consolidation of Marxist political leadership in Chile was not inevitable, and Allende had a long, hard way to go to achieve this. As a further example, a 1973 NIE, which addressed the possibility of enhanced Soviet influence in Chile, stated that Soviets were interested both in increasing their influence in South America and in Allende's successful coalition of leftist party as a model for Marxist revolution through election. Yet, the estimate went on to say that the Soviets did not want another Cuba on their hands and they were reluctant to antagonize the U.S. And C. The committee had determined that the analysis responsible for drawing up the Chile NIEs were not privy to information concerning covert operations approved by the 40 Committee and being implemented in Chile by the CIA operators. The explanation for this is CIA compartmentation. Analysts and operators often exist in separate worlds. Information available to the Operation Directorate is not always available in the Intelligence Directorate. As a result, those who were responsible for preparing NIEs on Chile appear to not have access to certain information which could have added to or substantially revised their assessments and predictions. That flaw was telling. It meant, for example, that the 1972 assessment of the durability of oppositional sectors was written without knowledge of covert American funding of precisely those sectors. Thus, there was no estimate of whether those sectors would survive absent U.S. money. C. Congressional Oversight. With regard to covert action in Chile between April 1964 and December 1974, CIA's consultation with its Congressional Oversight Committees, and thus Congress' exercise of its oversight function, was inadequate. The CIA did not volunteer detailed information. Congress most often did not seek it. Beginning in 1973, numerous public allegations were made concerning activities undertaken by the CIA in Chile. In response, Congress began to assume greater control in the exercise of its oversight function, which it had badly neglected in the past, both in the number and depth of consultations with the Central Intelligence Agency. Prior to 1973, there were 20 meetings between congressional committees and the CIA regarding Chile. These meetings were held with the House and Senate Armed Services and Appropriation Committees in their intelligence subcommittees. From March 1973 to December 1974, there were 13 meetings held not only with these committees, but also before the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Multinational Corporations and the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Inter-American Affairs. Based on CIA records, there were a total of 53 CIA congressional briefings on Chile between 1964 and 1974. At 31 of these meetings, there was some discussion of covert action. Special releases of funds for covert action were discussed at 23 of them. After January 1973, these briefings were concerned with past CIA covert activity. From information currently in the possession of the committee and public sources, several tentative conclusions emerged. On several important occasions, the CIA did not respond on covert action until quite long after the fact, and in one case, Track 2, it omitted discussion of an important closely held operation, reverberated on the foreign policy of the United States, and carried implications for domestic affairs as well. Of the 33 covert action projects undertaken in Chile with 40 committee approval during the period 1973 to 1974, Congress was briefed in some fashion on 8. Footnote number 3. Under Section 622 of Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, the Director of Central Intelligence is required to notify 6 Congressional Oversight Committee of every 40 committee approval once the President has issued a finding that the project is necessary for the national security of the United States. End footnote. Presumably, the 25 others were undertaken without congressional consultation. These 25 projects included the $102 million authorization in 1971, half of which was spent to purchase radio station and newspapers, while the other half went to support municipal candidates and anti-agenda political parties, and the additional expenditure of $815,000 in late 1971 to provide support to opposition parties. Of the total of over $13 million actually spent by the CIA on covert action operations in Chile in 1963 and 1974, Congress received some kind of briefing, sometimes before, sometimes after the fact, on projects totaling about $7.1 million. Further Congressional Oversight committees were not consulted about projects which were not reviewed by the full 40 Committee. One of these was the track to attempt to foment a military coup in 1970. The other, a later CIA project involving contacts with Chilean military officers, was an intelligence collection project and thus did not come before the 40 Committee, even though in this instance the political importance of the project was clear.